Hi, I'm Selena, and welcome back to my channel, or welcome for the first time. This is falling apart. Okay, so this is part two of the first installment of a new series I've started on my channel. The series is going to be I read my best friend's favorite book. I'm going to be doing different videos with a lot of my different best friends, and the first best friend I chose is Udi. We read his favorite book. Actually, I think I need to point that way because it switches. Udi. This is Udi. You probably know him because a lot of you found him through me. No, found me through him. What? Okay, yeah.
It's morning over there. It makes sense.
Yes, it is morning over here. I have my obligatory booktube tea. It's here.
Hopefully that's not a double entendre because booktube tea.
Oh no, I didn't come to get into booktube tea. Booktube tea is a whole mess. Okay, so yes, as I said, this is the first book that I read for this series, and that book is, oh no, I didn't even get the book out. And that book is Princess Academy by Shannon Hale. And this is one of Udi's favorite books, or his favorite. Which one is it, Udi? Is it like, do you consider this your favorite book of all time?
This is probably, maybe it's the favorite of all time. It's definitely like the one that means the most to me.
So just a quick introduction to this book. This is, I mean, today we would probably call it a middle grade, but it was published in 2005. So it was published in a time where middle grade and YA were kind of blending. And so it doesn't quite feel like the middle grade of today, and it doesn't quite feel like the YA of today. The two age groups hadn't really, and their norms hadn't really developed fully yet. So that's, yeah, but it is fantasy, and it is about not a little girl. She's 14. There's this 14-year-old girl named Miri who lives in this mountain town in the highlands of her country, or of her territory, I guess. It is foretold that the prince will marry someone from this town. And so the royal not court, but like some royal people come up and basically create this academy to train these girls to be maybe the next new princess. So they have to learn manners, they have to learn diplomacy, they have to learn a whole lot of skills so they're fit to be the wife of the prince. And then once they're done going through the Princess Academy, the prince will come and choose one of them to be his bride. And so we follow Miri through all of this as she is very headstrong and what else is she? What would you describe Miri as?
She's really smart.
Really smart.
She's like defiant in a certain way. Like, she, on the one hand, like there are things about her society and her world that sort of make her feel put down. And she just accepts those and she just keeps trudging forward. And she, like, you know, when she's offered opportunities, she takes them. And then she, like, you know, she's in a sense like your stereotypical like working girl. But also, like, she's so much more than that because she's very empowered. That's the term I'm looking for, right? Mm-hmm. Like, she's sort of forced into a lot of different things in this book, and then she treats them a little bit like, she treats them like opportunities, and then she takes them to the next level that nobody expected her to take them, and then she makes life better for herself, for her friends, for her society, and honestly, that's, like, really inspirational.
She's a great main character. We will get back to her. Yeah. So, Udi, when did you read this book for the first time?
I read this last year in July, like the end of July, so almost a year ago now.
And I read it yesterday, which is so cool. It's a year later. Okay.
A year ago, we didn't even know each other. And now we're reading each other's favorite books. This is friendship. I actually remember I was doing an internship like I am right now. And I was doing an internship in India, actually, and I was just getting back into the mode of, like, I want to write again. And so I was like, if I'm going to write, I need to read. And so I started looking for fantasy books to read, and this one, like, caught my eye. And so I just bought it on Kindle, and I started reading it. I took it with me to work, and I was about, like, 5 pages in, maybe, when I went to work in the morning. By the time I went home from work at 5 p.m., I was finished with the book.
Yep.
I didn't work that day.
In 12 hours. As per the readathon challenge. let's just go into my first question for you, which I've written down, which is kind of all encompassing. And it's, what do you like about the book? What are your favorite things?
What don't I like about the book? What isn't my favorite thing? I honestly, I think I like everything. Like, there's nothing in this book that really made me just say, like, that really, like, threw me out of the story or really made me, like, slow down my reading. Like, obviously, I read it in a day. And it's not even like you, where, like, you had a readathon, and you wanted to read it in a day. I did not want to read it in a day. I wanted to take a couple of days so I could, like, do my work at my internship and I could have time to no, none of that. For me, it was, I sat down in the morning, started reading it, and it was finished before I finished work. I think the main reason for that is Miri as a character, as we were just talking about, and we'll talk about her more later. But I think she really grabbed me, and her struggles really connected with me. I think the plot of the book, it's one of my favorites. It's got a lot of, like, my favorite, like, stuff in storytelling. It's got a lot of, it's got a lot of teen drama, which is always fun, but it's not like over the top melodramatic love triangles, backstabby teen drama, right? It's like, it feels more real because it's about, like, people just trying to be friends with each other, but also, like, having to work out their differences. So as much as I love Gossip Girl, it's not that. It's better than that. I love the world as well. We see a little bit more of the world in books 2 and 3, but even in just book 1, we see Mount Eskel, and we see a little bit of the surrounding areas of Mount Eskel. And I think Mount Eskel is a really, like, incredibly well-developed society. It's actually, like, the first time I feel like, I think this is really, like, the first sort of quote unquote, like, high fantasy story that I read, besides, like, Ranger's Apprentice. But, like, I really got a strong sense of the world just from that. The prose we were just talking about, like, the prose is so good. I'm jealous of Shannon Hale's ability to write prose. The excerpts from the songs of the Mount Eskel people at the beginning of each chapter, those are really good. All the side characters are so much fun. I don't quite remember their names anymore. I do remember, like, Asa and Pater and who was that other one that's, like, really important
Britta, there's Qatar.
to the story? Britta, yeah, Britta and Qatar. I do remember, yeah, those ones. Like, they're all my favorites. One thing I really liked about the story, actually, and this is something that Shannon Hale talks about a lot, is that, it's a story that's got the word princess in the title. It's a story that's got an almost all-female cast, right? And yet it never felt like I was reading a story for girls, right? Like, there are lots of stories like this, particularly middle grade, that are, like, gendered, like, this one's for boys, this one's for girls. What I really liked about Princess Academy was that even it's got an all-female cast, and it feels like it's for everyone. I feel like any kid can pick this up and, like, feel empowered by Miri, because it's not about her struggles. Like, it's not like it's not about struggles as a girl in, like, early high school or late middle school or whatever. It's about, like, struggles that everyone faces at those ages. And the way that she uses education to empower herself and her community is something that I feel like everyone would take inspiration from. And I honestly, like, it's one of my favorite things about the story.
She also, I was on the title bit. I'm going to respond to a lot of what you said, but on the title bit and the fact that it's not necessarily a story for girls, I actually really like that, because, like, okay, so even me, I'm a girl. I've been a girl my whole life. I can still fall into this, like, internalized sexism thing. Like, I remember when I was reading Little Women, or I was meant to read Little Women for class, and I did read Little Women. I was not expecting much of it. The copy that we were supposed to get, which is my Penguin Deluxe copy, which I love, the copy we were supposed to get for class was really pretty. So I was like, oh, maybe it'll be fine, because I like the cover. But, like, it never occurred to me that, like, I would like something called Little Women. And I don't know why. Like, it just didn't seem to appeal to me, because it seemed so gendered, which, like, Little Women is and isn't. Like, I think it centers girls and girl stories, but it definitely, I mean, it's enjoyable for everyone. Like, it just is genuinely an enjoyable story. And Princess Academy, I think a lot of people can fall victim to the same thing, thinking, like, it's not for them, or, it's just, like, a girly story that's not deep or meaningful, or it's not like it's not something that they would enjoy. When it is the title Princess Academy is like a perfect title in that the Princess Academy really does change everything, but also it is a title that I think turns a lot of people off because it gives it doesn't give the wrong impression once you read it, but before you read it you're like, and it's like, why do we do that? Why do we do that?
Yeah, it's the perfect example of a story that uses like things in fantasy that feel like very standard, and then uses it in new and interesting ways to talk about different themes than what we typically see in fantasy, right? Because like, how many stories have you read that explore education, and like how many fantasy stories have you read that explore education and economics as deeply as Princess Academy explores it? Right? Like when we think about like world building for fantasy stories, like whenever I'm like building a world, it's always like I'm thinking like, what do I want to like build for this world? I'm always like, okay, well, religion, politics, I don't know, the army, right? I'm always thinking about like those types of institutions. And one of the things that Princess Academy does so well, and it's like, but we see those things all the time. How about education and economics? And let's build a story around that. I'm not, I don't think she intentionally was like, hey, let's take education and economics. But the fact that she built a story around those two sort of world building concepts is, I think, something that makes this story really unique. And honestly, like if I'm recommending it to someone, I'd say like, yeah, it's called Princess Academy, but it's more about the academy part than the princess part.
Yes.
Because like there are like, it's called Princess Academy, but how many princesses are in this story?
Exactly. Right? You have to read to find out. But yeah, I think I was shocked by the amount of world building and how deep and intricate it was in this story, which is not like, I don't feel like I had a wrong impression of what this book would be, mostly because of its genre. Like this looks very middle grade. It would probably be considered middle grade for most of us today. But if you read it, it's really like in that bridge area where the Goose Girl is, and a lot of Shannon Hale's books, her older books at least, which I've read, are they deal with like, it deals with like really complex themes of classism and education as being like denied to people, and how like prejudice and just a lot of stuff. I definitely felt like I could see Miri have this, she and her people had this really not great relationship with the Lowlanders, where the Lowlanders were kind of constantly underestimating them and constantly not giving them what they were worth. And you see Miri really engage with that, and you just see her really, I don't know, she just develops this really realistic anger towards Lowlanders and like prejudice back at them. And you're like, well, yeah, it's like everything Miri is saying is like completely deserved. Like they are treating them this way, and it's just really good.
Yeah, and like on that note that you said about like how everyone is like a lot of characters are like privileged, or they're like not privileged. Like one thing that I found in like Brandon Sanderson's books, and like other authors' books as well in fantasy, is that a lot of characters are either like, if this is society, a lot of characters are either like up here or they're down here.
Yes.
Right. There's like but with Miri it feels like this is where the whole thing is. She feels like she's here. Right. Mm-hmm. Like not really, not like totally in the middle, but like sort of like, but not like totally at the bottom either.
Yeah,
right? Like she feels like she's somewhere in that. Exactly. She's not, she's not Vin, who's like, she's not Kaladin, right? Like she's higher than that, but she's also not like Adolin and Shallan. She's not privileged, but she's not just like completely downtrodden either.
And I love that, because I do think we need more characters where, like I think sometimes it can get to be, if you're going to talk about themes of classism or racism or prejudice or anything, it can kind of become, there's an expectation of, well, I have to talk about, I can't allow this character to have anything. I have to put them at the worst possible position. Like we can't, like suffering has become kind of the norm to talk about these things, where it doesn't have to be. Like joy and joyful books can also touch on these subjects. Especially privileged readers expect suffering to be at the center of these books, whereas like Princess Academy, it's just not. It has a lot of dark aspects to it, darker than I was expecting it to go, but it does, I don't know, in the end it really is a really sweet and sweet story where Miri is not, unhappy with her lot in life. She's not being mistreated by everyone. She has really good things in her life that she, can appreciate.
Yeah, and like one thing I appreciate is that like, you mentioned earlier that she's got this really realistic prejudice towards the lowlanders and stuff. And one thing that I really appreciate about her is that she's someone who isn't just like locked into her beliefs, right? She is someone who's willing to talk to people, who's willing to compromise, who is willing to learn, and like she's willing to be the one who reaches across the aisle or down the hill, as the case may be. And I think that that's one of the most admirable qualities about, like, one of her most admirable qualities. Like, reading her felt very, like, it felt like I was reading, like, a real human being, which, like, I've read those books where, and this goes for, like, both male and female characters, really. But I've read those books where you read a character and it feels like the author's either, like, holding back on making them flawed, or they're just like throwing every flaw possible into the character, or they're making the character flawed but pretending that the character isn't flawed. Like, they're not realizing that the character has flaws because they don't believe that they're flaws. And so I think one thing that I really appreciated about Miri was that she's just, she's just a 14-year-old girl trying to be a part of her community and using education to make the world a little bit of a better place for her and her family.
And then I think there was one more thing you touched on about what you liked about Princess Academy. Shannon Hale's prose. It is so good. It is like lyrical in a really subtle way. Like, it's not this sort of flowery writing, but it is beautiful and lyrical. I think especially when she's in Miri's head and Miri is really thinking through something and having like a transformation go on in the way that she thinks about something, or she's having a really spiritual moment.
When I read this book, this was when I was first getting back into writing. So I didn't know how to read books for like technical craft. And so when I read the book the first time, I didn't really have like the greatest understanding of like how good the prose was. And I also didn't like know how to like sit down and break down the prose. And it wasn't until like I opened the book just to like read like the first page again. Like, it wasn't until I opened the book then and just reread the first paragraph that I was like, oh my God, this book's prose is actually really good. Cause like now I read books and I'm like, oh, I can break down the prose. I can like break down what this author's patterns are and stuff. Right. When the first time I even like started to like even think about Shannon Hale's prose, I was already almost done with book 3. At that point I'd missed like almost the entire trilogy of prose because I wasn't really like in a writer's mindset at the time. And so it's something that I want to reread at some point soon because I really want to like re-experience it now, looking at it through a bit more of a writerly look, to like look at that prose and truly acknowledge how good it is.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of writing, so I know that you are a writer, you want to be published, and I know you said you weren't reading or looking for her writerly craft, like you weren't there yet in your reading, but is there any areas where you take inspiration from Shannon Hale and this book in your own craft?
I think definitely in world building, as I like what I was talking about earlier. I think not so much like I want to write stories about education or economics, but I think there's 2 aspects to it. I think the first aspect is I want to I think one thing it's encouraged me to do is to try like new and unique things with world building. Try to like not even like do the old types of things like religion and stuff better and more unique, but actually just go for things that we don't typically write stories about. What if we had this is one of the ones I wrote earlier this semester, actually, like at the beginning of 2020. But what if we had a story about an industry where dragons were used for racing, about a kid who is struggling to like find his way in this industry and realizes that growing up he might have been a great dragon racer, but now in the big city, he's got to start small and he's got to work his way back up to the top. And like, that's a very different type of story than what we typically see in fantasy. And so it's things sort of like that explore different themes than what we're used to in fantasy, different concepts of world building. And I think the other thing is, one thing that I really liked about like Mount Eskel and the Academy lore and all that, I think it's to really like dig deep into a few things with world building. Like one of the things that's so unique about Princess Academy is how like contained and deep it actually goes. Whereas like, a lot of stories are like, here's a whole planet, or here's a whole continent, or here's a whole country for you to explore. And Princess Academy is like, no, none of that. We're at a mountain village and a little academy at the bottom of the mountain. And that's it. There's nothing else. And I think just encouraging me to like go deeper and smaller and see if I can do things in a smaller amount of space. I think that's something that this book has like really helped me to focus on a little bit more.
Yes. Also, on that note, I wanted to bring up the trope subversion for like fantasy or like typical like princess story, specifically tropes that happens in this book. I think this book has a lot of trope subversion. It reminded me of the Palace Chronicles, because this one also deals with like princessy stuff. But Princess Academy also, like, I don't know, it just really, it was very clear to me that it was playing with the whole princess trope a lot.
We have so many expectations of what princesses are. And like from the moment they like enter the Princess Academy, they're like, the literally the book just says to you like, no, take everything you thought about princesses and throw it out the door, because that is not what princesses in this story are. Princesses actually have like an important job. They need to have all these skills, and they need to be better at it than princes. And they need to know how to talk to people. They need to know how to eat properly. They need to know how to dress properly. Like there's so much like work that goes into being a princess. And like, that's, I just enjoy any story that has trope subversion, but I really like, that was one of the things that I guess drew me in very quickly when I started reading the book.
Yeah, and one thing that I really liked about the education and the education that Mary and the other like possible princesses receive at the academy, they put it to use not just as like to be the next princess or the future wife of the prince. Like they put it to use in their day-to-day life. Like Mary, when she's talking to when she goes back and starts talking to people in her village, she uses her diplomacy skills, and it just goes to show you that like it was just a really nice, like, you can apply these skills anywhere. They're good for anyone to use. Like there's a lot of value in being a princess in this story,
because there were a lot of like choice involved for them about whether or not they like wanted to be a princess. A large part of the story to me felt like it was about like the power that education has to affect communities. I think it's a really relevant theme, both within the United States, where it was released primarily, but also like outside of the United States, where a lot of societies are still getting access to modern education. I know in India, especially, I actually hear an anecdote. So when I was in 10th grade, my house does like these yearly trips for all of its students. We travel internationally. And there's sort of three types of trips. There's adventure trips, and there's cultural trips where we sort of immerse ourselves in a culture. And then there's service trips where we go and we work with schools or we work with hospitals or wherever, and we provide some sort of a service to those societies. And I remember in 10th grade, I went on one to South India, and we set up this program with a school that had been running for like 4 or 5 years now. And the name of this trip was called Teaching for Empowerment. And what we were basically doing was we were setting up lessons and stuff to where we literally taught students how to figure out what issues are going on in their communities, and then how to like go about starting to solve those problems. And Princess Academy really reminded me of that type of service that we provided, where it like at the end of that week, I really felt like I had made a difference, because I could honestly see like students who weren't really talking at the beginning of the week. By the end of the week, like they were talking, they were making suggestions of how to solve problems. Like that's just, starting to talk in class, that's a form of empowerment in itself. And being able to teach that to students felt in a lot of ways like this book reminded me of that sort of a feeling. And I think that seeing how Miri like uses education and uses, like, she learns to read, and then like the things that she reads and the way that she uses those to improve the lives of her community, like that to me felt very much like this is what education can do for a society. This is the power that modern education has to help people. We always like talk in very abstract terms about how important education is to but we always talk about like, you need an education so you can get a job, so you can make money, right? And we often forget like the actual purpose of education in the first place, right? The purpose of education in the first place is to give people the skills to contribute to society, and the way that we've set up the economy is so that they get a monetary gain in return for the contribution to society. But like the purpose of education is to create people who can contribute to their society, and who can contribute to their society better. And I felt like that's what Princess Academy, like, instead of showing it to us in abstract terms, and we always talk about that stuff, it was like, here's concrete. They learn something, they use it, their lives are better.
It also was interesting to me. It's interesting to me that you say that, because I think that one of the problems with education in America, that I've experienced at least, is that the system in many ways is a bit broken, and the things that are taught are no longer really things that I feel like people will put to use. It's specifically talking about like English class. You've seen my vlog, you know my feelings on this. I don't care about the symbolism of the mockingbird and To Kill a Mockingbird. Like, I would rather talk to, like, I want to be an English teacher. I would rather talk to my students about like the different themes of the book, and like I would actually rather have them think critically and critique the books rather than just sort of trying to figure out what the author was doing or whatever.
Like when we read The Great Gatsby in school, like if I have to talk about the fucking eyes or the green light one more time, I'm so done with the green light.
And I think Princess Academy, in its own way, comments on that brokenness of the system as well through their teacher. Because we're talking about how great the theme of education is and how Miri and all the girls like really use that education.
Yeah.
They have to teach themselves a lot, because I don't want to spoil anything, but they're not given the tools, and they're not given the same benefit of the doubt that they're able to learn this stuff. And so they have to really take things in their own hands a lot. And I think that this book is kind of talking about how empowering education is, but it's also talking about how you have to do it right. And there's a lot of people who don't necessarily teach the right things or for the right reasons. And so that's also there in the theme. It's just a really complex theme.
Yeah. And if you want like proof that Miri's a badass, like you just look to the fact that even before everybody else realized that you have to teach yourself, she was already teaching herself. She was teaching herself from day one, right? Even before, like she basically taught herself how to read. She taught herself how to like study economics and read more complex stuff. She taught herself history. She also taught herself the magic system. Like she figured it out all on her own, right? Like she's so cool. She's so smart. And I think that like she's a really good sort of like leader figure in this school, without ever feeling like, she's like, I'm going to be the leader, or everybody else being like, you're the leader, right? It always felt like she was a very natural leader, who not even because like she's like, nobody else can lead, I guess I have to do it. It's always like, I just want everybody else to have what I have. It's a perfect story in the way that Miri sort of exemplifies all the themes that we've been talking about, but also in the way that everybody else exemplifies those same themes. It's fantastic. I love this book.
I think I have just about one more thing to say, especially and it does tie into the education theme. but the magic system, I wanted to touch on that because it's so cool. And what I loved with the magic system, I don't want to spoil anything because it is something you kind of have to figure out with Mary.
Yeah.
But it's very, I will say that it's very specific to her culture, and specifically her culture on Mount Eskil. It's not something you can learn anywhere else. It's unclear how far reaching this magic is. And I really loved that because among this theme of education and, like giving opportunities to people who have less opportunities, and maybe I just related to this because I'm a first generation college student in my family. And so in a lot of ways, sometimes it feels there's a divide between me and the rest of my family. It feels like sometimes people in my family think that, like they love that I'm getting education, but they also aren't fully, they sometimes think that I'm like leaving them behind or something. But I really loved that she was able to give this small town a lot of merit on its own. Like it didn't have to be, it had its own form of culture and education and everything, and it has its own specific things that you can't get anywhere else. And it can't really be taught in a princess academy. And so I loved that there was a balance of that. While this education from the outside is really important and everyone in the town could put that to use really well, there is something very specific about living in the town and the culture of the town. There was one line that really stuck out to me, and it was something Asa, what's her name? I forgot her name. When she said at the end that she, this might be minor spoilers, so just skip. I'll put a time where you can skip if you don't want to hear anything. But she says this line where she's like, that they're inputting more permanent education in, and S is like, yeah, I'm used to my mom being the smartest person I know, and I would like that to still be true. And it was just so sweet to me, and I loved it.
Yeah, they're like, first of all the characters are such nice people. Like this is one of the books where I'm like, I'm happy not to read about a bunch of like, you know, grumpy knights radiant just like swinging their swords at things they don't like. It's a very pleasant book to read. With on the magic system, I think we can say a little bit about it. It's basically a magic. It's a form of magic that allows you to communicate. It allows the people of this culture to communicate with each other. And due to certain circumstances in Miri's life, she doesn't quite have access to this magic communication. And she starts to figure out how to use it once she goes to the Princess Academy. And I think one thing that I really appreciated about the magic in this was that, if you read something like Mistborn, like that magic's awesome, right? Like there's nobody who doesn't love the magic system of Mistborn except people who feel it's a little bit too video gamey, right? But one thing that I really like about the magic system in this book is that it's magic, and it's like a thing that we see in fantasy all the time, but it's magic used specifically as a tool to work more on the themes of the book, right? It ties into Miri's theme of feeling left out, feeling alone, because she's the only person who can't use it, right? It ties into the theme of like figuring things out for yourself, of empowerment, right? Because Miri has to like learn it on her own. It ties into some of the themes of leadership, because once Miri figures out the actual mechanics of it, she starts to like teach the specific mechanics of it to her friends, right? And there's a lot of parts of this magic system where the development of the magic system over the course of the book matches the development of the themes and the character arcs. And I honestly felt like it was so well handled. It was so symmetrical. Like the whole book, everything in the book feels like it rhymes.
Which is really interesting because of
the
importance of singing and rhyme.
Yeah. And I mean, a lot of fantasy books, like they don't do that, right? Like, which is fine, right? Like a lot of us like to have unclean endings to our books, but there's something to be said about a book that has all of its arcs so perfectly and almost flawlessly executed, that it feels like a lot of the notes at the end mirror notes at the beginning, and yet they're different somehow, which is how a complete arc of a story, at least in literary theory, is supposed to end. So I don't know. It was a really nice read in summary.
Yes, it really does. It's just a solid book. Like, it's so solid from start to finish. I always struggle with Shannon Hale's pacing a little bit, but that's more of a me thing. I do think this book is really just, I mean, it clearly shows that Shannon Hale is very proficient at the craft of writing, and she can place things thematically, plot wise, character wise, she hits all the beats. And so if you're looking for a short, sweet middle grade story or middle grade YA-ish story that's kind of deeper than you expect and darker than you expect and more complex than you might be expecting, Princess Academy is for you. Well, thank you, Udi, for coming onto my channel and introducing me to this amazing book. And I'm very glad that we got to hear your thoughts on it, because this is your favorite, and now it's one of mine. So it's a good ending. Good ending.
Awesome. Like and subscribe.
Oh my gosh. Thank you for watching, everyone, and I will see you next time. Bye. Okay, we can do a thumbnail where we just like smile.
Hold on.